Have you ever wondered how George Lucas structures his films? Well, here's a word from the man himself.
And it's told actually in 3 acts, which will become obvious later, and it's the same story told 3 different times, 3 different ways. This is the more conventional way of telling that story in the first act. The second act is a very abstract way of telling the story, and the third act is a very action-oriented way of telling that story. The films are actually composed along the lines of music, which is that there are many themes going on through the films, and the themes are repeated using different orchestration. I'll tell a story in one way, and then I'll change it and have the same story or the same dialogue used by other characters in other situations, so that you have this sort of recurring theme going on constantly.
By The Empire Strikes Back, Lucas had perfected the art of layered foreshadowing. The most well-known example we're all familiar with is when Luke sees his own face in Vader's helmet. And while there is a lot more foreshadowing in The Empire Strikes Back, today I'd like to ask, what about the next movie, Return of the Jedi? Does it have any repeating motifs that rhyme like poetry? Well, I'd like to share what I've noticed to be loads of great foreshadowing, such as Leia as Anakin's daughter. But what other motifs are there from the first act that infuse the rest of the film with rich foreshadowing? And how do Luke and Han tie into this? And how do these motifs inform the prequel trilogy, bringing everything around full circle? Let's see what we find when we take a closer look. Let's start by just quickly running through the first act, then we'll move on and look for repeating motifs in the second and third acts. In the first act of Return of the Jedi, our rebel heroes attempt to rescue their friend Captain Han Solo from the clutches of the vile crime lord Jabba the Hutt. R2 and 3PO enter Jabba's palace as gifts, freely given to Jabba by Luke in hopes of ingratiating himself with Jabba. Han's best friend and co-pilot is then brought in as a prisoner by a bounty hunter adorning a breath mask and speaking with a voice modifier. The bounty hunter negotiates his price with the threat of a thermal detonator. Jabba likes his style and agrees. Later that night, the bounty hunter sneaks over to Han and begins to unthaw him from the carbonite. Turns out the bounty hunter is Princess Leia, who had kind of started a romantic relationship with Han before he was frozen. And it was her love for Han that motivated her to take this risk to free him. Unfortunately, the hibernation sickness has robbed Han of his eyesight.
I can't see.
Temporarily. And, as it turns out, Jabba had been expecting this all along, and was actually setting up a trap to ensnare the both of them. Luke soon enters, sees Leia has now become Jabba's slave, gives Jabba an ultimatum, but Jabba won't have any of it. Now, desperate and fearing for the safety of his friends, Luke grabs a nearby blaster, but he is quickly dropped into the lair of the bloodthirsty monster down below. Keeping his wits about him, Luke uses the bones of the Rancor's previous meals to defeat the monster. The Rancor's keepers weep and mourn his death. Furious, Jabba decides to punish them with the worst death imaginable, being thrown into the Sarlacc pit. Leia watches on through the window in desperation as her friends are being sent to their doom. Now, I sometimes see people complain that Luke didn't have a solid plan for rescuing Han, and they say this is a reflection of poor writing. But I think this is all kinds of good writing. On paper, Luke had a pretty logical plan to rescue Han. But in his ignorance, he failed to factor in a few key points, and he underestimated Jabba. And I think these shortcomings are very important storytelling-wise. We need to see that Luke has progressed some since the last film, but that he's still young and hasn't quite mastered anything, not even himself. When going into the last act of the film, we need to wonder if Luke can succeed, if he will make some fatal mistakes, if there are some things he hasn't considered, and if he can ever master himself. But now, fortunately, before this failing rescue attempt of Han, Luke was clever and resourceful enough to smuggle his lightsaber inside the unassuming droid and get him into the environment as a gift. When all seemed lost, R2 launches Luke his lightsaber, which was the ace up the sleeve that salvaged everything. With it, Luke used his growing Jedi skills to ultimately save the day, while Leia saves herself by killing Jabba with the very chains he used to enslave her. Alright, now, I see all this as a perfect setup to parallel the third act with a yin-yang twist. But continuing into the second act, the rebels become grafted into an alliance with the diminutive indigenous inhabitants of Endor. Luke then tells Leia what he himself recently learned, that they are in fact brother and sister, and Vader is their father, which, as a result, fulfills the foreshadowing with the breath mask and vocoder. Certain he can save their father by convincing him to return to the light side, Luke then freely surrenders himself to the Empire and is brought into the Emperor's throne room as a prisoner. And his lightsaber is brought into the environment, given to the Emperor a bit like a gift.
A bit.
We even have the two guards at the door. And again, on paper, it seems like Luke might have a good strategy, but again, there were some elements he did not factor in, and he did not realize just how strong a hold the dark side had on Vader. He also underestimated the Emperor. Luke soon learns he and the rebels have been expected and have fallen into the Sith Lord's trap.
It's a trap!
Now, Luke is on the inside, watching desperately through the window as his friends stand on the edge of their doom. Unable to resist the heroic urge to destroy the Emperor and save his friends, Luke grabs his laser sword and a fight with his father ensues, just as the Emperor wanted. Vader eventually threatens to turn Leia. Luke then explodes in a fury of rage and overpowers Vader in an attempt to kill him, after swearing he could never do that, and he slices off his hand. The Emperor is pleased by this and urges Luke to finish his father off. Fortunately, in the failing rescue attempt of his father, Luke becomes aware of his own dark side, his own monster down below, and his subconscious condition that he would only love his father if he became good again. And here, Luke sees the similarities between he and his father, that he must have been turned in the same way, for the same reasons. And in seeing this, he can't help but have compassion for Vader, loving him unconditionally, whether he returns to the good side or not. Luke then removes his lightsaber from the environment, refusing to go down the dark path.
Jedi,
thus winning the moral victory.
I am a Jedi.
So Palpatine
Like
then
my
decides
father
to execute Luke and shoots him up with some Sith lightning. Anakin is touched by the unconditional love Luke has shown him and decides he can't let Luke die. So, while Palpatine is preoccupied with the sadistic pleasure of killing Luke, Anakin, despite grievous risk to himself, grabs his now former master and throws him down an ominous chasm, finally putting an end to the horror.
What sort of chasm?
So, with his love and resolve, Luke has finally mastered himself. And in doing so, he inspires Anakin to pull himself out of the deep freeze of his Sith life, so he can ultimately redeem himself. Meanwhile, with the help of the unassuming Ewoks, the rebels have finally begun destroying the Death Star. Luke tries to carry his father to a nearby ship, but Anakin implores Luke to leave him and save himself. However, before parting ways, Anakin wants his helmet removed so he can look upon his son with his own eyes. Much like Leia freed Han from the carbonite, Luke frees Anakin from his life as Vader, and they both did it because of their love.
Someone who loves you.
Only true love can free the frozen, ossified hero. I definitely get the impression Jabba and the events of the first act of Return of the Jedi were meant to serve as a prelude to the Emperor and the third act. In fact, if you take a listen to the music, even their respective theme songs are almost similar in every way, with only some minor variations. One distinction being in the first few notes. The only difference is the second note in Jabba's theme is an octave higher than the second note in the Emperor's. I think there may also be a parallel between the Rancor keeper mourning the death of his pet monster and the relationship between Luke and Anakin. As George Lucas said,
I like the idea that everybody loves somebody. And even though this was the worst big horrible monster you could possibly imagine, that his keeper loved him. And he probably loved his keeper.
Including a mourning scene like this is unusual and seems to serve more than just a purpose of comic relief, namely that of Anakin, despite all of his monstrous dark deeds, was still loved unconditionally by his son, which ultimately redeemed him and reconciled the Skywalker family. I remember watching Return of the Jedi for the first time in the theaters back in 1983 and thinking this figure entering Jabba's palace is Darth Vader, and I highly suspect that was the intention, as a visual metaphor. I mean, Luke even force chokes the guards. Both Leia and Luke go into Jabba's palace as Vader, if you think about it. Or, more specifically, as representatives of their father, Anakin, who went into the Empire as Vader and eventually destroyed it from within. In this case, Leia is Anakin the slave, and Luke is Anakin the Jedi. And like Palpatine with Anakin, it was Jabba who brought Leia into his proximity, and it was with their chains that they struck back against their overconfident oppressors. Luke and Leia have become heroes, like their father. And thanks to his children, Anakin returns as the heroic Jedi he once was, and finally puts an end to the horror of the Sith Empire, and restores balance to the galaxy. There's also a nice symmetric contrast in the first and third acts, in that the heroes had to descend to the lowest low point of the galaxy to confront Jabba, what I refer to as the bottom of the outhouse of the galaxy. Then they climb up to the highest high point to confront the Emperor, just as Luke had to look down into the shadowy depths of his own soul to achieve the heights of spiritual victory. Much like the roots of the lotus flower must reach down into the muddiest muck to allow for the blossoming of the beautiful flower up above.
There's always echoes of everything you see gets echoed somewhere else.
So, let me know what kinds of foreshadowings you've noticed in Star Wars, and thanks for watching. And by the way, this was my cake for my 8th birthday in 1983. The Rancor's keepers weep and mourn